Hello and welcome. My name is Rob Sandoli from the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm so delighted to kick off this virtual event, which we've titled Delivering on the Promise of Energy Efficiency with Digital Technologies. I'd like to begin by thanking our host, the European Union, as well as the entire small but effective Secretariat at the Energy Efficiency Hub. For those who may not be familiar, the Energy Efficiency Hub is a voluntary partnership of 15 member countries, plus the European Commission, who are interested in pursuing government-to-government collaboration to advance energy efficiency policies and practices. I have had the pleasure of serving as the U.S. delegate to the Energy Efficiency Hub, as well as vice chair of its steering committee. I have also had the honor of helping to guide the efforts of the Energy Efficiency Hub's Digitalization Working Group. It is this working group, which includes 9 of the 16 Energy Efficiency Hub members, that brings you the content for our event today. And why is this content important and relevant for this audience at COP27? Because simply put, successful deployment of digital technologies can improve energy efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions up to 10% in the building sector alone. You may hear that message again over the course of the next hour, and that's okay, because it bears repeating. So what exactly is in store for the next hour? First, we'll hear from Vikas Chanjan from the U.S. Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Lab. The lab has served as the operating agent for the work we'll discuss today, and its researchers bring great expertise on the topic of digitalization. Vikas will get us level set by introducing what the key digital technologies are in the building space, from smart meters to energy management systems. He'll explain why digitalization makes sense for buildings and provide an overview of the Digitalization Working Group and its objectives. Next, we'll turn to Catherine Ott, also from the Pacific Northwest National Lab, who will summarize findings of a report that analyzes case studies from participating countries regarding programs to deploy digital technologies. Catherine will also provide an overview of the Digitalization Working Group's new roadmap. The roadmap is specifically oriented to address key barriers that countries have encountered when trying to implement digitalization programs. Then my colleague Brian Walker from the Building Technologies Office at the U.S. Department of Energy will lead our panel discussion. We'll hear from our expert panelists about their experience and advice for promoting energy efficiency with digital technologies, services, and programs. Brian will moderate an interactive discussion with panelists, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions too. And I'll be back at the end to briefly wrap it up. So let's get started. Vikas, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name is Vikas Chandan, and I am a scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Me and my colleague, Catherine Ott, will take you through this presentation. Can we have the presentation slides, please? Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? As the participants in this session would be very well aware, effects of climate change are being felt across the world. Here in the United States, we have seen an uptake in extreme weather events, right from wildfires in California to snowstorms in Texas to severe hurricanes in Florida and Alabama. In response, United States policy supports decarbonization across all sectors with speed and with scale. Next slide, please. In the Digitalization Working Group, we have chosen to focus first on buildings as they represent an appreciable fraction of global energy demand and global energy-related CO2 emissions, as can be seen from this chart. Now, I want to clarify, when we talk about digitalization in the building space, we are talking about a diverse set of technologies. So on the one hand, we have devices and systems such as smart meters, smart thermostats, home and building energy management systems, and digital twins. Then we have computational methods and platforms such as Internet of Things, advanced control algorithms, machine learning algorithms, cloud databases, and high performance computing. And finally, we have programs that leverage digitalization, such as demand response or transactive energy. Now, digital technologies can play a large role in cutting building energy consumption, as Rob mentioned. The IEA estimates digital technologies could cut around 10% of total energy by 2040. Also, many digitalization technologies that actively raise energy efficiency and reduce carbon emissions in buildings are also less expensive, and they lead to fast returns on investment with payback of less than 3 to 4 years. So digitalization is ripe with all this opportunity for building decarbonization, but there are also a few challenges. And that takes us to the next slide. So this brings us to the digitalization working group of the Energy Efficiency Hub, which currently consists of 8 member countries and the European Commission. The United States is currently serving as the lead. Next slide. The key objective of this working group is to analyze the effectiveness of current practices and approaches to leverage the potential offered by digitalization technologies to advance energy efficiency in buildings, and also provide recommendations and best practices for the future. Our international team has been working very hard over the last year to serve on this mission. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Catherine Ott, who will take us across specific elements of our work. However, before I do that, I would like to ask the audience to enter in the chat if they have any specific questions that they would like us to get answered. Time permitting, we will try to get to some of these questions in the discussion session that immediately follows Catherine's presentation. Over to you, Catherine, and can we get the slides on, please, again? Thank you.
Thank you for the great introduction, Vikas. Next slide, please. Last spring, our team conducted a review of publicly available literature to identify and characterize major barriers associated with implementing digitalization policies and programs that drive building energy efficiency. Our report published earlier this fall builds on that literature review to incorporate interviews with working group members, gather case studies from DWG members, and review existing digitalization tools, many of which Vikas mentioned earlier. The main barriers to digitalization that we explored are cybersecurity, privacy, interoperability, and data availability and analysis. In the report, we highlight 5 main barriers, but we chose to incorporate only the 4 that you see here in the roadmap. Energy consumption is the 5th barrier, and it overlaps with the other 4, so there's less individual focus on this one from the DWG members. The roadmap complements the report by analyzing the collected case study templates to identify near-term, mid-term, and long-term approaches to addressing these 4 key barriers. Next slide, please. The roadmap lists key objectives for addressing each barrier, and it lays out a pathway to achieving these objectives through the use of appropriate practices. The suggested implementation is divided into 3 phases specific to each barrier, but these phases can generally be thought of as developing and designing practices, pilot testing practices, and large-scale adoption of the practices. Next slide, please. I'm now going to guide us through the intended use of the roadmap, basically in a user's guide format. So let's say I'm a policymaker and I'm interested in learning how cybersecurity, for example, influences digitalization deployment and what I can do to ensure that the programs and initiatives I work on are in agreement with recommended cybersecurity practices. I would start by reading the brief introduction to the cybersecurity section of the roadmap. This is level 1, and it includes a short description of the barrier as well as some key objectives for overcoming this barrier. The information comes directly from the report, so it's easily accessible for anyone that wants more details. Next slide, please. Next, I would proceed to level 2 of the roadmap, which describes challenges and practices identified from the working groups, interviews, and report research, and it separates these into the 3 deployment phases that I mentioned earlier. For reference, the building icon with all the little windows indicates industry involvement, and the one with all the columns indicates government action. If I want to better understand a phase, I can read about how this phase specifically applies to the barrier. Phase 2 is shown here, which for this barrier, cybersecurity, involves pilot-scale implementation of frameworks and incorporating security by design into products and programs. Next, I might want to explore specific challenges and see where they come from and how the practices listed were implemented to help me really understand that practice and make its usefulness more concrete. So I'd reference the resource list to see which case study the enabler came from. And for instance, the idea for practice protection profiles under phase 1 came from Germany's Act on the Digitization of the Energy Transition. Protection profiles are specific specifications for security architectures that detail specifications for data protection security. These profiles are implementation independent, and they allow manufacturers the leeway in the technical design of security requirements while ensuring that minimums are met across the board. And now I might want to learn more about this practice under phase 2. So I'd click on it, and I would find out that this comes from Japan's Next Generation Smart Meter System Study Group. And maybe this idea seems particularly relevant to what I'm working on, so I want to explore it more in depth. Next slide, please. Now we're on level 3 of the roadmap, which in this case shows a partial case study template from our DWG members. Each full template can be found in the report's appendix. Level 3 of these completed templates, as well as the case study and barrier description sections in the report, can be used to find more details on each of the challenges and enablers. I can use level 3 to learn more and determine if it's relevant to the program or initiative that I'm considering. In addition to the fields that you see here, these templates also have information on key challenges, lessons learned, and links to additional related programs. Next slide, please. I'll now dive a little bit deeper into the content. A lack of interoperability limits consumers' willingness to adopt technologies, as well as the effectiveness of these technologies for energy efficiency once deployed. Building owners, managers, and occupants want access to information from across a wide range of manufacturers and product types, and these devices need to work together to achieve maximum operational efficiency and energy savings, which in turn optimizes that return on investment mentioned earlier. Standard communication protocols between technologies and between consumers, utility companies, and third-party service providers is therefore essential. Cybersecurity and privacy, both of which are barriers on their own, need to be integrated into interoperability efforts, as increased communication can lead to higher risk of attacks and unauthorized access to data. The table shown here highlights potential challenges practitioners may experience related to interoperability, and it also highlights methods that countries within the DWG have used to overcome these challenges. For example, taking on a large project to make all digitally connected devices in a building interoperable at once is quite expensive. But if this process is done at intervals as part of normal lifecycle investments, the additional costs are significantly reduced. Next slide, please. Being able to access their data can inform consumers of their energy use habits and drive them to adjust their behaviors. And that leads to energy savings. Furthermore, many devices and platforms demand real-time energy consumption and supply data for programs such as demand response and optimization functionalities of the devices themselves. Unfortunately, much of the data that would be useful for these purposes is lacking in terms of quality and availability. And even when the data does exist, for energy savings to be realized, analysis must turn this raw data into actionable decisions. And many analysis tools that use methods such as machine learning and advanced control algorithms are in a state of the art rather than state of the practice phase of development. One solution to increase data availability that's been implemented by many of our DWG members is smart meters with sub-metering capabilities. These meters communicate remotely with utility companies as well as devices within the buildings to provide real-time high-resolution data. Smart meters are mentioned in a few enablers on this table and throughout the roadmap. But the granularity of smart meter measurements can actually exacerbate privacy concerns, which is another barrier. And that's why it's important to examine the roadmap so holistically. Among other suggestions, the privacy table in the roadmap recommends practices specifically for mitigating smart meter privacy concerns. The roadmap therefore encourages and helps practitioners to avoid the unintended consequences of exacerbating one barrier while mitigating another. Next slide, please. Digitalization can be a cost-effective approach for reducing energy consumption in buildings. Active solutions are typically less expensive to implement and generally lead to faster return on investment than traditional physical solutions. Compared to passive solutions, digital technologies can renovate 10 times the space with the same budget. However, 4 barriers, cybersecurity, privacy, interoperability, and data availability, stand in the way of realizing digitalization's full energy efficiency potential in buildings. This roadmap, supported by the report, will inform practitioners about best practices on deploying digitalization in buildings gathered from analysis of 8 DWG member countries. An interactive version of the roadmap will be available soon on the Energy Efficiency Hub's website, and the report is already online at the following link. Thank you for your time today, and I'll now hand it back to Rob to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a great overview of the roadmap. I'm now excited to turn to our panel discussion. The audience should have access to the bios of each of our expert panelists. So I'll just briefly introduce our moderator, my colleague at the U.S. Department of Energy, Brian Walker. Brian is in our Building Technologies office and manages our work on building controls and grid edge decarbonization. Brian, over to you.
Rob, thanks so much. And thank you all, of course, to the participants in today's session. Thanks so much to everybody who is participating in the live discussion online. I'm already seeing robust participation in the discussion session. And as Vikas had mentioned, we'll be getting to those questions later on. First things first, though, I want to introduce our panelists who will be presenting very quickly this morning. So the first of our panelists will be Ms. Amandine Vernenier, Project Manager for Energy Regulation of Buildings from the French Ministry for Ecological Transition. Up next, after her, we will have, let's see, we're going to have Vincent Berruteau from the European Commission Directorate General for Energy. And at that organization, Vincent is the head of unit. Then following Mr. Berruteau, we're going to hear from Linda Babylon from the German Energy Agency, DENA, where Ms. Babylon is a senior expert for digital technologies. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Mr. Clay Nestler, who is the founder and CEO of the Nestler Group and is also supporting the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory as a consultant. So these are going to be very quick talks, only 5 minutes apiece. And so I encourage anybody who's following on and listening to please, if you've got questions that haven't been addressed, please type them into the chat and then make sure to reach out to all of us, read about our bios after the fact. So for now, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Ms. Vernier.
Thank you, Brian. So to begin with, I can say that France is open to innovation and therefore to digital solutions. Indeed, the regulation we put in place includes specific procedures for taking into account new solutions not yet listed in the regulations. So the main technologies therefore have an impact on the regulations, but France wishes to maintain technological neutrality and therefore favors obligations of results and not of means in its regulation. Thus, all types of solutions can be installed in building as long as they have the same effects, such as, for example, reaching a threshold value in terms of consumption or in terms of emissions. Still, some regulation requires the installation of specific technologies, such as the obligation to install building automation and control system, known as BACS, or temperature control systems. So there is already an obligation in national law to install BACS in non-residential buildings equipped with heating or air conditioning systems, whether or not combined with a ventilation system, if those systems have an effective rated output of more than 290 kilowatts before 2025. New buildings have to be equipped as soon as they are built. This obligation is actually derived from the current European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the EPBD. Yet, as part of its energy efficiency plan, France wishes to go further in this obligation, since the installation of BACS makes it possible to reduce energy consumption rapidly and at relatively low cost. So we want to impose the installation of BACS for all non-residential buildings equipped with a heating or air conditioning system, this time with an effective rated output of more than 70 kilowatts, compared with the current 290 kilowatts, and that from 2027. In the same time, we are strengthening the regulation related to the temperature regulation systems. It is actually already mandatory to install such systems when changing or installing a heating or an air conditioning system. Therefore, the new systems are all equipped, but the old ones may not be. Thus, it will soon be mandatory to equip every non-residential and residential buildings with such systems before 2025. The systems have to be able to regulate the indoor temperature by room or by heating or cooling zone at an hourly time step by respecting a set temperature. Thanks to this new regulation, we will soon have to install bags in more new non-residential buildings and temperature regulation system in every building. And this will actually help us to reach our target of reducing our national energy consumption by 10% by 2024. In addition, the French government is encouraging companies for non-residential buildings and individuals, particularly in collective housing, to equip themselves with devices for measuring energy consumption by area of use or by dwellings. So these devices initially make it possible to become aware of the most energy-consuming items or of our own consumptions, and eventually to implement appropriate solutions to increase the energy efficiency of the buildings. That's it for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Vernier, from the perspective from France. Now we will turn it over next to Mr. Berruteau from DG ENR.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's Directorate General for Energy at the European Commission, and good afternoon to everyone. A big thanks for inviting me to this event. I think the European Commission has been supporting the activities of the Energy Efficiency Hub, and it's very interesting to hear about the latest activities in the field of digitalization. We consider digitalization as a very important subject in Europe, and this is a subject that has gained importance over the years. Our energy system is becoming more and more electrified, decarbonized, decentralized. There's a need for more integration, and therefore digital technologies play a growing role to increase energy efficiency and renewables, but also to ensure flexibility and make sure that we match supply and demand at all time. And yet, as Kathleen showed, I mean, there are a number of barriers that prevent us from unlocking the full potential of digital technologies, and this is why the European Commission adopted about a month ago, and it was on the 18th of October, an action plan on the digitalization of the energy system. And I would just like to say a few words about that plan because I think it fits very well with the subject of this session. We've organized it according to 5 main intervention areas. And the first one aims at facilitating the access and exchange of energy data to develop new services. I think the barrier of lack of interoperability was mentioned. It is very true. That came time and again when we consulted our stakeholders. And we've identified 3 use cases, high-level use cases to begin with. A, demand-side flexibility. B, the smart charging and bidirectional charging of electric vehicles. And C, the uptake of smart buildings and renovation. And what we propose in our action plan is to develop a common European energy data space, which means a framework of common standards and practices specific to the energy sector to share or jointly process data. A data space that will come with a data exchange governance structure that will guide and manage the process. Our second intervention area is about promoting investments in smart energy infrastructure. And for that, we will support the transmission system operators and the distribution system operators in creating a digital twin of the electricity grid. This is an action that will begin very soon. We would also support the national regulatory authorities in defining common smart grid indicators as well as objectives for these indicators. The third area of intervention is directly targeted to consumers. And there we propose measures to use digital solutions to empower them. I mean, we look at privacy, of course, and we've got regulation in this area. But what we propose as well is to develop tools, guidance, a platform to foster the development of energy communities. We will also develop a common reference framework for an app that help consumers reduce their energy use, especially during peak time. And we will also establish a partnership under the EU Pact for Skills to raise the digital skills in the energy sector, which was another barrier that we've identified in our consultation. Fourth area, we look at the other side of the coin, and what must be done to ensure cybersecurity. In Europe, we have cross-sector legislation in this area, but we also propose to add specific measures for the energy sector. And last but not least, as a fifth action, we also propose measures to reduce the carbon footprint of ICT solutions, meaning measures that increase energy efficiency, reuse waste heat, and promote the use of renewable energy sources. And here we hacked on several fronts: eco-design and labeling of products, with, for example, the development of an energy label for computers, measures targeting communication networks, with, for example, a code of conduct for the sustainability of these networks. We also have measures directly targeting data centers, for example, an environmental labeling scheme for data centers. These are the five big parts of our action plan. But on top of all that, our plan puts forward a number of cross-cutting actions to reinforce coordination at EU and international level. For example, we plan to provide guidance to the member states for the update of their national energy and climate plans. We also want to give them advice for orienting their recovery and resilience funds so that they can invest more in digital solutions. We would also have public funding available, and notably through the Horizon Europe program, to foster research and innovation in the digitization of the energy system, including in the building sector. We will have big priorities in this area starting from next year. And finally, we plan to reinforce international collaboration using the existing tools that we have at our disposal. And the Energy Efficiency Hub is a very important one. And this is why I'm very happy to attend this session today and discuss this important subject in an international setting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bruto. Next up, we will be hearing from Ms. Babylon from the German Energy Agency. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about the German perspective on energy efficiency, digitalization, and climate protection. The energy transition is an important project with regard to climate protection targets in Germany, and Germany has been transitioning towards a renewable energy supply for some decades, really. And the two main pillars are expansion of renewable energies and, of course, energy efficiency. We have made quite some progress on the renewable supply side. In 2021, already 42% of the gross electricity demand is renewable in Germany. So the decarbonization of the electricity supply has made some progress. And the electrification then helps to decarbonize or also other sectors, including the buildings, but also mobility and industry. So through electrification, we can move forward in this area too. And in the building sector, of course, heat pumps are one important technology that is used here. The target for 2030, though, is to have 80% of electricity supply from renewables. This leads to a very decentral, very fluctuating generation in Germany. And this means that greater flexibility in grids is needed. And this also includes cross-sectoral flexibility and the demand side. And this is, of course, where buildings come into play because they have huge energy demand. There are some specific targets for the building stock in Germany as well, and they're quite ambitious. Germany wants to achieve climate neutrality of the building sector by 2045. Of course, efficiency standards are an important part of this, but the integrated energy transition is a word that I would like to use here because buildings are more and more integrated with the electricity sector and mobility sector. The target for 2030 is to have 50% of the heating generated climate neutral, and heating is, of course, the main part of the primary energy consumption in buildings. And important technologies in Germany are going to be heat pumps, but also heating grids. Today, we still rely heavily on fossil fuels, but the share of heat pumps is increasing and has 15% of the market in 2021, which was, for example, supported by a funding program. For Germany, it is clear that digitalization is key to handle the future energy system with its complexity and the need for coordination and automation. This was also stated in Germany's digitalization strategy, which was published this year. And Germany intends to speed up the integrated transition in all sectors. The digitalization of the energy transition has an important core project regarding the digital infrastructure. It is the smart meter rollout, which is in Germany developed as a cross-sectoral platform as well, enabling also demand-side management while meeting security needs. We have made some progress in the successful development of robust cybersecurity and privacy standards was mentioned earlier already. It is supposed to be an interoperable, secure system, which also provides data, which needs to be available for energy efficiency measures. So many of the identified challenges are addressed by the smart meter rollout. Of course, the challenge here is to speed up the certification progress. The delayed technology rollout is a challenge for Germany, and customer acceptance needs to be not forgotten. So the smart meter really shows many facets of the digitalization project, the importance of security, but also the need for business models for the companies and the use case for the end customer that is needed. And I would like to finish by saying that this infrastructure program, Smart Meter, is for Germany only the first step, of course, towards using the data along the value creation chain for many analytics and controls which come later on in the chain, data governance, data energy spaces, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Babylon. That was a really good, I thought, encapsulation of some of the issues that we continue to face. We'll certainly want to return to some of those again with the questions. But for now, we will turn it back to Mr. Clay Nestler, who again is supporting the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory as an independent consultant. Mr. Nestler, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you to the EU for inviting me to present at today's panel discussion. Digitalization in the United States goes back to the 1970s, actually, during the energy crisis, when every attempt to reduce energy consumption, something we should be familiar with today as well, went into place. The very first building automation systems were introduced. The first building automation system had 64K of memory, had a 0.5 megabyte of storage, and today my Apple Watch has probably 10 times the computing power of that first building automation system focused on energy efficiency. Today, I'd like to share a policy case study. I chose one that addresses 3 of the 4 major challenges and opportunities identified in the roadmap: data access, privacy, and interoperability. I'd like to talk about the Green Button Initiative, which was launched by the US White House in January of 2012, about 10 years ago. It was based on a very successful program called the Blue Button, which was, again, a White House initiative to provide consumers with access to their healthcare data. It's the first time patient records were available to individuals, and it was a very successful program emulated to address energy efficiency. It involved a voluntary consensus industry standard, whose development was led by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a branch of the US government. And that standard was a consensus industry standard that was adopted by utilities and energy service providers to provide information to consumers. This was driven by a survey at the time that found that half of all US households were interested in third-party applications that support energy reduction through rewards, advice, and other means. Vasant's presentation talked about tools and talked about digital solutions. This was an attempt to provide a platform for exactly those type of digital solutions. The green button standard allowed access to data on intervals as short as a minute or up to hourly, daily, or in fact annual, really depending on the smart meter implementation of that particular energy service provider. 60% of all households in the United States have smart meters, and the penetration continues to increase. There was a special version of this protocol called Green Button Connect My Data, which allowed third-party service providers to get access to a home or business owner's data in order to provide services to that homeowner. 60 million homes and businesses today have access to data through this service. 50 utilities and electricity suppliers are participating, and 35 companies have developed apps to use this data. Very, very successful. A couple things we learned. A big marketing campaign by the White House was really needed to encourage adoption of the standard. There was a challenge. There was $100,000 US was put in place for a challenge to develop the best apps, nothing like private sector competition to bring out the best innovation. But I would say that there is one challenge remaining. It is the green button, but there are many shades of green. And it turns out that every utility, because of the flexibility in the standard, has a different flavor of the standard. So it's not exactly plug and play for service providers, but it certainly provides great value. Back to you, Brian.
Great. Well, Clay, thank you for that. Very helpful case study. We're going to turn now to a few questions. And if you've been saving them, you're in the audience, and you haven't typed them into the chat, we do encourage you to make sure you get those in. My colleague Vikas and I are standing by to look at those. But in the meantime, I wanted to kick things off with a question for all of you. And Ms. Babylon, you did anticipate this a bit with your own remarks, as well as you, Mr. Bruto. But I was curious, given the complexity of the energy transition generally and digitalization technologies, their integration more specifically, naturally, this is an effort that governments can't do on their own. It's going to require some kind of a partnership, some kind of work with selling to customers, working with private sector manufacturers, that kind of thing. And so I wondered, based on your experience, and I'm directing this question to the entire panel, to each of you, what are some of the best practices to engaging industry in your experience for the design and implementation of these digitalization technologies? So for that, I think we'll go in the order of the speakers. And so Ms. Vernier, we'll start with you.
Well, we can say that in order to generalize the use of digital technologies in the building industry, well, for example, France launched in 2019 the Building Information Modeling, or BIM plan. This plan, steered by the public authorities, aims to mobilize and support the building industry to provide professionals with concrete methods and tools to massively increase digital use by 2022, actually, so this year. And so to this end, the government has made various documents and support tools available to stakeholders to help them develop the use of BIM. So it's a method that has actually quite worked. So we can say that, yeah, we need to support some digital solutions so that it can be increased, their use can be increased.
Great, thank you so much. Mr. Berruto, over to you.
Yeah,
best practices on engaging the private sector. Yes, please.
Yes, I fully agree with what Mondine said. I mean, I as policymaker, I think we need to be clear to industry on our vision, targets, action, and in the European Union, we have the European Green Deal, where we committed to be carbon neutral by 2050 and to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So these were very clear commitments at the highest level. And last year, we decided to revise our energy legislation to align it with these objectives. And an important piece of legislation in the area of building is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which is being revised now to fit with this new ambition. And I think this legislation will give industry an incentive to be engaged in the deployment programs that we refer to. This year, we went one step further. After the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we came up with a clear plan to accelerate our energy transition and stop imports from Russia. And recently, we came with our action plan on digitization, which highlights the benefits of digitization and hopefully will stimulate demand for digital technologies in buildings and in other sectors. So all these policies and measures and strategies in Europe point towards the need for more electrification, the need to decarbonize, to decentralize our energy supply, to better integrate the different sectors, and therefore they point towards more digitization. So this is in my opinion, this is a clear signal to the industry to not only deploy digital solutions, but also to step up their research and innovation efforts, so as to remain competitive. And we've got in Europe a number of programs that we are implementing to stimulate research and innovation, but also to stimulate and foster the market uptake of new innovative solutions, where our objective is then to remove the non-technological barriers to make it easier to implement the solutions and to raise the skills of people. I mean, Amandine mentioned the BIM system. I mean, that's a very powerful one, a very powerful tool to facilitate digitization in the building sector. But what we notice is that a lot of the building workforce people don't have the necessary skills to use it. So I think we need to use also the public funding to help in raising the skills, both digital and energy skills of the building workforce. Thank you.
I'm so glad you both emphasized that, because we hear that from our industry stakeholders all the time. So thank you, Vincent and Amandine. That's raising the workforce issue in particular is critical. Linda, over to you. I wanted you to enlarge on some of what you were talking about in your own earlier remarks.
First, I would agree with the point that was just made to focus on the workforce who has to really implement the technologies. It's an important topic. Engaging private sector, one experience that was made in Germany are the so-called SINTEC, that's German short for Showcase Intelligent Energy, a project which were from 2017 to 2021, large funded programs which were really pilot testing, which Catherine mentioned earlier as an important thing to do when developing intelligent technologies. And one of the projects, so we have had 5 big model regions in Germany, and just one of them, which I introduced in one of the digitalization working groups earlier this year, was the WindNode project, which had 70 partners alone. And these are all kinds of organizations who are interested in being part of pilot projects and developing technology together, researchers, but many companies as well. And some of these projects, of course, also included how to integrate buildings into the energy system. And these kind of projects really help everyone to learn and to build knowledge, which then helps also developing the workforce. I would like to make one other point, which I already mentioned. Why are companies interested in this? Of course, they see some chance to have a business opportunity later on. They become experts in the use of digital technologies. And of course, they see that a country is going forward in this direction and they want to be part of it because they also see business opportunities.
No, that's a great point. That's the classic win-win, right? If it looks like all the directions, all of the goals are aligned. Oh, that's a great point. All right, Clay, back to you.
I can't resist piling on because I full-heartedly agree that workforce skills are a large gap and a primary concern to industry. As part of the EE Hub in the United States, we held 2 industry stakeholder workshops with 35 leading thought leaders in the area of digitalization and energy efficiency. And their consensus view is actually frightening, that actually digitalization can make buildings harder to operate and maintain and optimize. We have a long history in the United States of building operators coming from the armed forces, particularly the Navy. If you go down the unmarked door into the basement where all the equipment is, you'll often find someone who can listen to a hissing valve or look at a needle on a meter and be able to troubleshoot what's wrong. These experts are not digitally literate, potentially. We now have an entire generation of digital natives who are experts in digital technology and databases and apps and do everything from their phone, but they don't know a lot about building systems. We have to meet the challenge and bring those 2 worlds together, share the knowledge of how buildings really work and use energy and those digital technologies. The other thing I would bring up is in the United States, we've had great success with what we call challenges. The Better Buildings program is an incredibly successful program that involves building equipment manufacturers, control system manufacturers, real estate holders, cities, governments, all coming together to advance energy efficiency in buildings. There was a campaign called the Smart Energy Analytics campaign where hundreds of systems were installed in buildings, rigorously analyzed. So we now know quantitatively not only how much energy we can save through digitalization, but what the cost and return on investment was. At least in the United States, these challenges are very popular and provide tremendously useful information. Back to you, Brian.
Great, thank you. And Clay, if I may, I'm going to take the same approach. I have a question from the chat that I think gets at some of this, a similar kind of subject. And I'm going to actually ask the panelists to respond now in the opposite order. So apologies, but that way we'll give Amandine and Vincent a little bit more time to consider their answers. One of the questions that is coming in now concerns social communities. Really, the way they're posing is, how does digitalization, how could it, or could it, period, it's also challenging the premise maybe, how could digitalization contribute to stronger communities? Or is that going to be inevitably a problem if we're considering some of these same kind of workforce issues? So Clay, to you first, then Linda, then Vincent, then Amandine.
Yeah, so there's been some really interesting research around the world around behavior and how digitalization can provide information to residents and homeowners at a community scale. We've seen in utility programs that just sending a bill to someone that tells them how much energy they used may induce energy conservation measures, but what really helps is when you compare an individual's energy use to their peers in their community. It's a form of sort of competition. So if I know that I'm using, that I'm in the lowest 20 percentile of households like mine in my community, in energy use, that motivates me. That research was actually replicated in a city in India and found very, very similar results. So it's one of the things which we think is actually fairly universal to provide that information. Taken in the extreme, community energy through renewable energy and things such as that can be really facilitated through digitalization. People are talking about the ability to actually trade, right? I'm going to reduce, someone else can use more. People can work together in a community to improve resilience as well as green the grid. So I think tremendous opportunity there.
Excellent. To talk about bringing competition, that might make these panels much more closely resemble something like the Olympic Games than this sort of collegial, all in it together environment. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but if we move to that format, I don't think I'm going to be able to participate anymore. All right, Linda, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I can only build on what Claire already said. We at DINA are also looking at energy communities nowadays, and that's really where social aspects and the more and more decentralized energy system and digitalization come together in a special way. The energy system is more and more decentral and who are so more locally in a way. And the local actors in the energy system can become more important than two, and exchanging energy on a local level. And digitalization enables them. They can not only share energy with themselves, they may also be interested in taking part in local flexibility markets if they exist. An energy community could do this too, not only the big companies. So I can only agree with what Claire already mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Linda. Vincent, over to you.
I agree as well. You know, in Europe, we put a lot of emphasis on the development of energy communities, and we've adapted our legislation to make it easier to set up these communities. So what we want to do as part of our action plan is to identify and shortlist the digital tools and produce some guidance on energy sharing and peer-to-peer exchange arrangements that will help the energy communities, and they improve the understanding and the skills of policymakers, regulators, and local communities, so that we can really build up and support ICT and data-driven business model. What we want to do as well, perhaps more on the innovative side, is to develop also a first of its kind experimentation platform, so that we can test and simulate energy communities in combination with innovative activities, such as, for instance, blockchain-based energy trading. We think that this experimentation platform could also help to better understand behavioral responses to price signals, and so that we can optimize the benefits for communities and identify potential legal, regulatory, fiscal, or technical barriers that we may face. So I think there's a lot that digitalization can bring.
Yes. Oh, excellent. Thank you. And more on that in just a minute. I think that's a really nice, Vincent, a really nice way to tee up the last question, which we'll get to. But Amandine, before we do, what about communities and digitalization?
Well, I can only agree with what has already been said. We can use a lot of digitalization in especially residential building, I would say, so that people can be aware of their consumption and yes, take care of this consumption, be able to decrease it and compete with the other to have a less and less consumption for their dwelling. In France, we also have a system, well, it's actually European, sorry. It's a document that's called Energy Performance Certificates, and it's also a big way to make people, let's say, compete between the different dwellings. And it's a way for them to be aware of the conventional, I would say, consumption of their buildings. And so to be able to compare it with their with their real consumption via digitalization is a great way to make them reduce their energy consumption.
Great. Well, thank you for that. For the last question, I'm just going to ask whoever has an idea first, please go ahead and immediately say it. It's in the spirit of the fact that we are, of course, having this event on the margins of COP27. we're interested in knowing whether programs to promote deployment of digital technologies, whether this ought to be part of a country's building decarbonization strategy, in your view, or the nationally determined contributions. And if so, why is that? How is the best way to bake that in? So whoever has the answer first, or their own answer first, please jump in. All right, Clay, you're up.
I think it's a great opportunity for leading by example. And because digitalization is difficult to use the traditional energy efficiency levers of codes and standards. You don't send a control system to a lab and measure the coefficient of performance of like you would do a heat pump. So what seems to work is using the federal government, like the General Services Administration, the U.S. government's landlord, has a smart buildings demonstration program. There's the Smart Building Accelerator Act, which basically asks the federal government to benchmark private sector and introduce that technology as cost effective. I think there's great opportunity for governments at a national, state, and local level to demonstrate the value of this technology and build it into their carbon plans.
All right, Vincent.
Yeah, I think I fully agree. And in Europe, we've got it's very timely because we are revising now the national energy and climate plans. Every country is doing that, and I think it's a good moment to advise member states on how to do it in a way that promotes the use of digital solutions in order to save energy and increase the share of renewables and make the system more flexible. And that's what we're trying to do now with the guidance that we are providing to member states and that we should adopt in the coming days. And the next year, countries in Europe will send us their revised plans, and then they will finalize it next year. And I think that will be during this period until the plans are finalized, would be a good moment to incentivize them and to use digital solutions and develop programs in this area. And at the same time, I think we should also support them in prioritizing smart investments in digital solutions in their recovery and resilience plans. I think there's a lot of money available in these plans, and I think a share of that money should be directed towards digital solutions. Thank you.
Great points. All right, well, if there are no other further remarks, then I'm going to say, please, everybody who's watching in the chat, please join me in thanking our panelists for what I thought was a great and robust discussion. At this point, I will pass it back over to my colleague, Rob Sandoli, for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for moderating an excellent panel discussion. And again, please let me extend our thanks to all of our expert panelists, Amandine, Vincent, Linda, and Clay. And thanks again to our hosts, the EU, and their highly competent virtual team. And for the last word, I'll just reinforce what was just being discussed there in the very last question, and that is that the use of digital technologies and programs can be an important part of a cost-effective decarbonization strategy. So the decarbonization roadmap that we discussed earlier today will be posted in an interactive form on the Energy Efficiency Hub website. And so we hope that the members of the audience here find it useful and share it with practitioners in your respective countries. And with that, I wish you all the best for the remainder of the conference and for productive and impactful decarbonization efforts back home. Thank you. Bye now.